First of all, you got to start to understand that the letter of intent is like a handshake agreement. It is not binding. It's not legally binding. Generally aligns around price and terms, and that's it. You have to craft all of the legally binding agreements in the definitive agreements. It really should be definitive agreements because there's a lot of them. The focus shifts from just economics around price and terms to risk allocation and how the buyer evaluates the risk of your deal, how you may share in fortifying that risk for them. And it's frankly where deals get kind of reshaped. Hello and welcome to this week's Shoot the Moon podcast, broadcasting live and direct from Revenue Rocket World headquarters in Bloomington, Minnesota. For those of you that are new to Revenue Rocket, we are the world's premier M&A advisor to tech-enabled services companies. Today, with me are my partners, Ryan Barnett and Matt Lockhart. Welcome, guys.
Awesome to be here. I know, Ryan, you don't like it when I do this, but I'm going to kind of give away a little time frame here because we got to congratulate the United States women's hockey team on their gold medal. So that's pretty exciting. And I know we've got members of the audience who are not from the United States, but we need to root for something these days, so we'll take that. What's going on, Ryan? We're continuing on with the Masterclass.
Absolutely, and I apologize to our friends in Canada. We also love you too, but we'll take a win for the USA here today. We've been working through a masterclass. Mike and Matt, you've been really helpful in this process. And the point has been to really help educate leaders and owners of IT services firms who are looking at a potential transaction either now or just in the future. And what we've looked at so far is really helped you understand what it takes to get ready. That means starting with the discussion and decision, should I be selling? Walking through everything in that process from valuation to finding buyers to what the process is like, to getting to an LOI, to signing that LOI. And last week was really focused on due diligence. So today we're going to go past that phrase and imagine and picture yourself that you've had a letter of intent that's been signed. Your diligence has been going really well and you've been able to show a buyer your business. And they get to a point and say, this looks great. We're going to start crafting definitive agreements. And I'll start, the focus here today is how do we start to, if we survive the due diligence process, what's it look like to get from that 3/4 done to all the way? So, Mike, help me understand, if a seller thinks the deal is done with an LOI, really what changes when you start to get to a definitive agreement in this process?
Yeah, thanks, Ryan. Great question. First of all, you got to start to understand that the letter of intent is like a handshake agreement. It is not binding. It's not legally binding. Generally aligns around price and terms, and that's it. You have to craft all of the legally binding agreements in the definitive agreements. It really should be definitive agreements because there's a lot of them. And we'll talk more about that later in the masterclass. But, the focus shifts from just economics around deal terms, price and terms, to risk allocation and kind of how the buyer evaluates the risk of your deal, how you may share in fortifying that risk for them. And it's frankly where deals get kind of reshaped. And it's critically important during this phase of, kind of moving through as you move towards your definitive agreement, is to have a strong cadence around momentum because you can get bogged down. You can definitely get bogged down in the legal language in the definitive agreement, but also in sort of what you're representing and warranting in the business. And we'll get into that in a minute.
Yeah, thanks for getting us going, Mike. So if we think of that LOI as that handshake, the binding agreement starts to become that definitive agreement. You start to decide things like asset sale or a stock sale and everything that comes with it. The parties that are at the table change as well. And if Matt, maybe you could dig into that a little bit for me. If you think about that definitive agreement phase, and as Mike mentioned, a ton of documents, what documents are included in that definitive agreement phase, and what should owners be aware of and know about?
Yeah. Well, I mean, you started it out, right? The purchase agreement, and you'll often see an APA or an SPA, so asset purchase agreement or a share purchase agreement. But that's the big one, if you will. But there are others that matter a whole bunch to sellers, right? Employment agreement, for example. So regardless of if you're selling in or you're selling out, likely there's going to be a certain period that you're involved. If you're selling in, then, certainly an employment agreement is going to be appropriate. If you're selling out, well, then oftentimes there's sort of a transition services agreement. Think about it as a contract for a period of time. And both of those are obviously extremely important. The employment agreement is more important because you're setting the stage for your future employment, what the conditions there are, et cetera, et cetera. The purchase agreement and most likely the employment agreement will also have non-compete and non-solicitation aspects to those agreements, and those things are obviously super important as well. And then there's the sort of the tie-alongs to the purchase agreement that are critical, the disclosure schedules, and Mike will talk more about those. Mike, I know you wake up in the morning almost every morning as we get closer to a deal coming to fruition, thinking about disclosure schedules. Kidding, but they can become a sticky wicket, right? And super important, and obviously critical to get done correctly. There's the escrow agreement, if that is something that is going to be included in the purchase agreement, if there's escrow that is being set aside. And then there, can be others. There can be, lender agreements and et cetera, et cetera. So there's a lot of paper, and there's going to be multiple signatures. Again, most critical, that final purchase agreement, the employment agreements, and then any associated, non-competes, non-solicitations.
So there's a lot to go through, is what it sounds like. And Matt, you're not the only one that hears Mike say that too. The disclosure schedules are, and I'm just going to talk about later, all of this, when you think about the weight that goes on, heretofore you've been running your business. At this last week of close, this is a big focus, is that the business is going to go to someone else. And so to put everything together, what you're signing up for and all those agreements, there's a lot that goes on, and just understand that sellers can oftentimes underestimate the scope that's involved. But Mike, when you think about all these documents that are going on, who's who in the zoo here? Like, who should be driving at this point? And if you think about the people that are involved, an M&A advisor, an attorney, a CEO, who's driving the bus, and what's the best way to get through this and from an advisor capacity?
Yeah, as I've often said, it takes a village to get an M&A deal done. And you pointed out some of the people that live in the village, to use the analogy. Certainly, clear lanes of responsibility are important. And the M&A advisor sort of protects the economics and the deal momentum. And remember, we just talked about how momentum is important, moving forward at a reasonable, quick cadence, so you don't get bogged down, working around any roadblocks or stoppers that come into play. That's the advisor's role, is to keep everybody kind of moving towards a close date, right? Otherwise, it's too easy to reschedule the close date. And, we say around here that time kills all deals. That's true, because things come up or other distractions come along, or the economy changes, or, The Fed changes interest rates. There's a million things that can impact a deal if you spend too much time kind of getting bogged down. The attorney's role is more around protecting legal exposure, and they should stay right in that lane. I'll talk more about that in a minute. And the CEO really protects the relationships that have been developed in a positive way with the buyer, and keeps the business running. And this is one that, without the appropriate village assembled of people and advisors, can easily become a problem. Many stories of people approached by buyers, larger companies, private equity firms, sponsored companies, where, they say, wow, I underestimated the amount of time diligence would take, and it was like death by 1,000 cuts. And when I was in the diligence process, my business suffered because I wasn't paying attention. I wasn't running it. And when that happens, and it's in a buyer's best interest in some cases to do it. I don't want to say they intentionally do it, but they certainly can in some cases. They use that as an excuse to retrade the business. If there's softness in the deal, they'll use a reason to, change price and terms on the deal, because they'll say, well, the last several months we've been in due diligence. Your sales are down, or your utilization's down, or your business is not performing as it was when we started to talk. And they have a point. So it's important that you let the advisor kind of run and ride herd on all of this stuff, be able to be available to defend your diligence. A good advisor has a strong diligence defense team, so they can answer a lot of those questions. They've thought about what's going to be coming in diligence defense, gather that information from you in an orderly manner, and they can manage that diligence defense. It doesn't mean there's not going to be a lot of questions in diligence that are areas where you're going to have to weigh in, but you want to minimize those distractions. And then, the cardinal, I think, rule of what not to do is certainly to not allow your attorney to try to run the deal and defend economics and deal momentum. And the reason for that is they have their hands full on managing the legal exposure. Now, most of the lawyers want to do this role if they can, because it means additional billable hours for them, even though they are ill-equipped to do so. And, attorneys are a critical component to getting a deal done. But like all things, you need to have the tools and the talent to do your role effectively. And we think it's best, and we've seen this certainly many times, to keep your attorney in sort of the legal defense modality, and to have your advisors around, your M&A advisor kind of keeping the project managing this whole thing and keeping the wheels on. And then, you're running relationships and keeping the business running and, bringing in other spot advisors around tax advice and other things so that you can keep your eye on the ball.
Mike, I've heard a phrase from you that in this phase, it's often common for lawyers to trade deal points. And what I'm hearing here is that it's important for that M&A advisor to keep this going, so that you don't have the lawyers in the back room going off script here, which could potentially endanger the deal, trying to mitigate a risk or include a point where it may not be in the best interest of everyone at the table.
I would say for sure that's the case, Ryan.
Okay. Yeah. No. Thanks for help for walking through who's at the table, Matt. If I was to turn that a little bit into what are the things that the teams are working through. So if you think about that in the definitive agreement, I'm trying to get to what are the maybe 3 or 4 things that are always going to be negotiated, or most often going to be negotiated, understanding that every deal is itself, but what are 3 things that matter to most to the seller in a definitive agreement?
Yeah, well, let's sort of bracket that into the purely legal and then maybe a little bit more of the business. agreements and or understanding. So what I mean by that, so from a purely legal perspective, obviously there's some real critical aspects in that are in the purchase agreement. Yeah, indemnification, right? Warranties, indemnification, caps, baskets, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, that's oftentimes that's the, number one with a spotlight around risk mitigation that your merger and acquisition attorney is going to be all over and appropriately, protecting you as a seller. When I talk about the business aspects, and surprisingly, or maybe it shouldn't be a surprise, but oftentimes founder-led businesses, first time selling a business, doing a transaction, there's the working capital agreement, which is, will be included in the purchase agreement. But, there is a generally well understood sort of market, if you will, understanding that there will be a certain amount of working capital to operate the business for a period of time, and that will be left behind, if you will, that will be provided by the seller. And that sometimes, again, is a surprise. Now, we educate, very early and make sure that our sellers understand that is something that they should expect when they're doing their spreadsheet in terms of what's going to be left behind. We make sure they understand that there's got to be a stub in there for the working capital. If there is an escrow requirement as part of the deal, what does that escrow agreement, when is it released? How much is it? What is it for? What are the stipulations upon it being released? Et cetera, et cetera. And then the last, and this can be a sticky one. Well managed, it's not sticky because it's really about the two parties coming together, but an earnout. If an earnout is applicable as part of the deal structure, then that's a negotiation and an agreement that will continue forward. And obviously very critical to the seller as well as to the buyer. And what I mean, it doesn't need to be sticky. We often say an earnout and or a gain share, meaning you've got a target that needs to be met, right? And you should be on the same team. A buyer and a seller should be on the same team that want to go get that target. And so we always communicate to buyers that if you want to include an earnout, if it's appropriate to include an earnout, well, that is the seller accepting some risk, and so there should be additional gain for a seller, right, through accepting an earnout. And it's in the best interest of everybody for a seller to achieve the earnout, because that means that the business is performing and growing and continuing to sort of hit the goals that were agreed upon. But so, those are some of the things that are ongoing negotiations. And again, if you keep legal focused on the legal risk, they are going to be after all of those legal risk terms, the indemnifications, the warranties, et cetera, et cetera. The business agreements or the business negotiations that happen and are incorporated in the purchase agreement really should be the responsibility of the M&A advisor or the investment bank, of your representative, because they're with you all the way alongside. They are seeding the appropriate conditions for a negotiation, and they're in the best position to drive the very best agreement with those things. Did I miss anything?
I think those are the big ones that we see, Matt. I think you did a great job of those areas, and there's definitely pushback back and forth. I think the next question I have for you exactly, or which one, kind of where do you see some of those log jams? Yeah, that was a great job.
Well, I mean, any and all of them can be, if not managed appropriately. And this really goes to, sort of accentuating Mike's point around keeping momentum, also keeping the spirit. The most important letter of intent is I. Everybody has the intent. Everybody wants to meet the finish line. So, keep that momentum and start those discussions early and keep the pedal on them. And, being a Minnesotan and a hockey fan and an old hockey player, it's okay to be ready to get your elbows up at the right time.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. No, great work on that. It's a great answer. If I switch gears a little bit, and let's say, if we've got the large part of the definitive agreement done and agreed to, Mike, you again, we'll come back to this again. This oftentimes comes down to the last week or two before close, and sellers get to what we'd call disclosure schedule. Can you please help define what those disclosure schedules are? And why do they matter, and why do they take more effort than sellers might expect?
Yep. So disclosure schedules think about all of the details associated with every contract you have written that's active in the business, all your employee agreements, all your non-compete, non-solicit agreements, complete sets of your financials, any vendor agreements. This one's a big one. Whether that be with your internet provider, your landlord, your, utility provider, every agreement that's associated with running that business needs to be in the disclosure schedules. Okay. And that can be a big lift, right? Not to mention the fact that you're going to warrant. So the disclosure schedules are everything that's tied to your warrants. There's a lot of discussion about representations and warranties. So the representations you make and the warranties you make are supported by the paperwork of the disclosure schedules. And you're going to warrant that they're fulsome in their disclosure, meaning you may sign disclosure letters that say, we don't have any pending litigation, or we don't have anyone that's given us notice of termination, or that we have, whatever. That's going to be part of the definitive agreement. Now, if someone has said that they're going to terminate or sue you or do something that you have represented as being not to be the case, then you have to disclose it in the disclosure schedules. Otherwise, you're in breach of the agreement, right? So super, super important that it's done in a very fulsome way and that it's fully transparent. Anytime, if you try, I would just never encourage this. You need to be fully transparent in the disclosure schedules so that you can have an exception, for example, made. If you said no one has given us notice of termination and somebody a week before close says, hey, we're going to terminate, you have to disclose that termination in the disclosure schedules so that the seller doesn't come back or that buyer doesn't come back and say, well, you didn't disclose that and it impacted the economics of the deal. And now we're going to have to, we have liability. And so we're going to have to come after you for that liability. If it's in the disclosure schedules, they've reviewed it as part of diligence and signed off, then it won't impact the deal post-close. So think of it like an insurance policy. You need to be fully open and disclosed. Same thing with reps and warrants. You have to fully represent and warrant in a factual manner what the state of the business is. And that's to protect really everyone, right? You might say, well, maybe I don't disclose that because it seems like a minor thing. Well, if your buyer doesn't think it's such a minor thing or it turns into a major thing, then you're going to be on the hook for it if you didn't disclose it. And what the issue is that in disclosure schedules, there's a lot of paper. Like there's a ton of stuff. Even if you have your records in great order, all of the parties want the most recent version of those records. And oftentimes you have to pull them together right towards the end of the transaction. And almost everyone underestimates the time involved. It can take hundreds of hours to pull together all of the disclosure schedules. So for the disclosure schedules that are not time sensitive, and I would say that most of them are, you can pull them ahead of time. Like if you need a copy of your lease for your space, or you need certain things that really are not time sensitive, that's important. The thing that a lot of people overlook is consents. So, this isn't technically a disclosure schedule, but oftentimes it's related in that, your bank needs to have a consent or a release of, a filing, UCC1 filing pursuant to your line of credit, for example, or you have to have a change of control agreement, or you have your landlord has to agree that the buyer is creditworthy enough to take over your lease if that's what's going to happen. And they have to provide consent for the transaction. And those oftentimes are related to the disclosure schedules, and they come out of the disclosure schedules because when a lawyer reviews your lease, it may have very specific terms for how that lease can get transferred. So I'm just giving you some specific examples. So they tend to have some things that crawl out of the rocks when you're beginning to put forth your disclosure schedules. And I would always encourage you to start early and often and disclose as much as possible in the disclosure schedules as quickly as possible in order to close. We've had deals get delayed because people cannot assemble the disclosure schedules in a fulsome way based on the time they've allocated to do it. And it's critically important that you assemble a team, focus on it, and get to work putting those out in the wild to the other side so that if there's encumbrances or issues or things that are needed that come out of their review of the disclosure schedule, you have time to complete them.
Yeah, it's a great summary, Mike. So to take that, you're going to have to disclose quite a bit, start prepping early, make sure you've got all your documents in line. And this is something that's really going to stay with the transaction post-close. So if they're going to come back to something, it's often going to be in these disclosure statements. And that's somewhat backed by the representations and warranties of the deal, which might have some holdback and type language. So making sure that you're nailing that is just really important.
Well, I just add another point is there's this legal precedent called, is it in the four corners of the document? And it really should say, is it in the four corners of the documents? Meaning, is it in the definitive agreement as referenced and supported by the reps and warranties and the disclosure schedules? And if it's not considered to be pursuant to the transaction, right? So if someone mentioned it in passing, but it's not documented accurately in the definitive agreements, it doesn't exist in the eyes and minds of the law. And so critically important that, for example, you might think, well, I told them that this particular client was rolling off, but it didn't make it into a disclosure schedule. Too bad. You didn't disclose it. It wasn't in the four corners of the document, and you would have liability in that case. So, making sure that, everything's been communicated as clearly defined and captured in all of the definitive agreements in a fulsome way is how you avoid future liability there.
Great. Makes sense. Let's say if we look at and kind of all this has been done and all the work that has gone through this whole process, and we finally get to closing day. Matt, walk us through what does closing day look like? Is this just what are the logistics? What's it look like, and who's doing what and where, and what should a seller expect?
I'm chuckling because, oftentimes we hear from sellers, they're like, well, that was kind of anticlimactic, because pretty much on closing day, if done correctly, and it doesn't happen all the time, sometimes closing day can be a little harried, but it shouldn't be. Most often when well managed, closing day is just sort of the period at the end of the paragraph, right? Because everything it should be done, including you very well, and again, well managed. You've already put the signatures on the documents. Now, the signatures and those documents haven't been released to the other parties, but they're in place. So all of the agreements are done on closing day. And, we like to have a ceremonial call. Everybody's received it. The deal is done. And the money is starting to be released, right? And so, all the signature packets are delivered. The final schedules are in place. And the various wires are released. And when I say various wires, if you need to pay off lenders, those wires are going out. If there's an escrow agreement, those wires are going out. Most often in the payment from the funds is paying your providers, your lawyer, your advisors, et cetera, et cetera. So all of those are done, but those are kind of out of your hands. I mean, it's you have a closing call. Thank you, everybody. Let's go forward. And then again, well managed, everything just sort of transpires from there. So, and that's where, we hear from, wow, oh man, okay, right? And it's like, and then really most importantly on closing day is you figured out how you're going to celebrate, right? Whether that be a big old dinner, whether that be getting together with your team, whether that be, going to your quiet place and maybe having one of your favorite libations, but plan out something to celebrate because you've reached the finish line. So again, well managed, all of those things are in place. Not well managed, those pieces are not done, and you are tying out the final pieces. And then horribly managed or not done well, you're still negotiating something on the last day. Now, we don't let that happen. You as a seller shouldn't let that happen. And so hopefully it feels a little bit like an anticlimactic piece to what is a huge celebration.
Yeah, I would add and pile on there, Matt. I think, if everything's been done well, this can be done in a matter of an hour or less, typically routing documents for signature digitally, and, releasing wires is what happens as a practical matter. Everything else should have been done and considered and either signed ahead of time, so those signatures are with your lawyer in escrow, or executed in a way that your lawyer can release all of those documents. So there's not a lot of drama on that day. I would say more often than not these days, it's done ahead of time and held by your lawyer. So, because there can be, lots of documents to sign. And you can think just the logistics of people being online and having connectivity and being able to sort those and not have, connectivity issues or issues with authentication with the digital signature provider and all that, those can throw a technical wrinkle. So to get around that, we've certainly had most of our clients circulate digital signatures and be held by their lawyer ahead of time. So that means when they release signatures, it's really more about wiring logistics. And depending on where wires come from and originating banks and all that, that can take some time to get sent across. International wires got to clear the Fed when they come into this country. We've had more and more international buyers as of late. So, it can take, a day or two to receive wires. That's not uncommon. So, the advantage of having your lawyer hold their signatures is they hold those signatures until they receive the funds. Technically, the transaction is not closed until the funds are received. That can be received by your attorneys in their trust account, or it can be directly sent to you. But to Matt's point, it's mostly anticlimactic and ultimately more about, getting people paid and beginning the journey of integration. I think the best firms begin an integration plan ahead of close. But most of them start celebrating and thinking much more about how that can be when all these documents are finalized and when they're, effectively at the closing table.
Well, this has been a really helpful discussion, and if you're to this phase of this process, it is an exhilarating one, and it's at the same time, Matt, that's exactly the word I was looking for, anticlimactic. And which is usually a sign of something done well. You've done all the hard work, and it's a day to reflect and celebrate and look at what's next. And when we look at this masterclass, we've gone through that process of starting to think about what a transaction can be what a transaction can be, and we've gotten all the way to the end of what it is. And really the next topic that we have is what does the next 100 days look like after an acquisition? So we'll cover that in our next podcast. Mike, Matt, thank you so much for being really sharing a lot of wisdom here. I'm glad that we've actually had the opportunity to get to that final stage many, many, many times. And you're speaking straight from experience when it comes to this podcast. So thanks for your great work there and your great work in this podcast. With that, I'll turn it over to you, Mike, for any closing thoughts.
Sounds great, guys. Thanks a lot. With that, we'll tie a ribbon on it for this week's Shoot the Moon podcast. With that, make it a great week.